The late afternoon sun bathed Sonny's diner in a warm, golden glow. Located on the corner of Main Street in a quiet suburban town, the diner had a kind of timeless charm to it, a place where the locals gathered, where small-town gossip thrived, and where you could always find a comforting cup of coffee, no matter the time of day. The atmosphere was relaxed, with the clinking of silverware, the hum of low conversations, and the soft sizzle of food being prepared in the kitchen. At one of the booths in the back, Michael Davis sat with his back to the window, his broad shoulders slumped slightly in exhaustion. His once iconic basketball career, full of flashes of brilliance and epic games, was now a distant memory. What remained were the traces of fame, his towering 6'11" frame, his sharp jawline, and the legacy he had left behind on the court. As a retired NBA player turned sports analyst, Michael had found new ways to stay relevant. He was no longer the center of attention in arenas, but he had carved out a new life for himself, speaking at events and offering insights into the game he loved so much. But on this particular afternoon, Michael needed something more than the public's adulation or the thrill of a well-placed soundbite. He needed peace. In Sonny's diner, with its cozy booths and no-nonsense, wholesome food, was his perfect retreat. The smell of sizzling burgers and fries filled the air as he looked down at his menu. Even though he knew exactly what he was going to order, a classic cheeseburger, medium well, extra pickles, and a side of crispy fries, it wasn't just the food he was here for. Though, as he waited for his order, Michael's eyes scanned the room. It was a habit of his, the quiet observation of others, a skill he had developed as a player, always assessing the situation around him, looking for patterns, reading the crowd. At the counter, a woman in her late 40s smiled as she chatted with the waitress. Michael recognized her as Sharon, a local teacher. Near the window, an elderly couple, clearly well into their retirement years, held hands across the table. Their deep affection for one another was evident, and Michael couldn't help but smile softly at the sight. In the far corner, a group of teenagers sat hunched over their phones, too absorbed in their screens to notice the world around them. But it was the small figure sitting across from a sharply dressed man that caught Michael's attention. The man, Ethan Parker, had the kind of look that suggested wealth, his expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, and the watch on his wrist that caught the light in a way that felt out of place in this humble diner. He was speaking urgently into his phone, his voice low but intense, using words like unacceptable and you'll regret this. There was something about the way he spoke that felt wrong. But it wasn't just Ethan that caught Michael's eye. It was the boy sitting across from him, Kevin. The boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old, had a small, worn-out Spider-Man t-shirt that hung loosely on his skinny frame. His sneakers were scuffed and faded from what Michael could only assume were long days of running around the town, playing, probably in parks or with other kids. Kevin was quiet, his legs dangling from the booth, his gaze downcast as he fiddled nervously with a napkin. He seemed small, fragile in a way that made Michael's heart ache, a stark contrast to the man he was sitting beside. Something about the boy's demeanor felt off. Michael didn't know why, but his gut told him something was wrong. Kevin didn't belong here. Not in this diner. Not with a man like Ethan Parker, who had the air of someone who didn't treat the boy as an equal. Before Michael could dwell on it any longer, the door to the diner opened with a familiar jingle, and a young boy about 5 years old entered, holding the door open for his mother. Michael's attention briefly shifted, but his mind was still on the scene he had just observed. It wasn't long before the waitress delivered his food, and Michael sank into the comfort of the meal. But even the warmth of the burger and the fries couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He took a few bites and tried to focus on the conversation that was taking place at the counter. But his thoughts kept wandering back to the boy, Kevin. A few minutes passed in this quiet, almost meditative state, but then something happened that changed everything. The little boy, who had been quiet up until that point, stood up suddenly and began walking toward Michael's booth. His little sneakers barely made a sound on the diner's floor, and Michael glanced up, wondering if he was about to interrupt him. But it wasn't an interruption Michael had expected. The boy stopped in front of Michael's booth, his large brown eyes filled with something far beyond his years, an earnestness, an innocence, and perhaps fear. He hesitated for just a moment before speaking. "Excuse me, mister." The boy's voice was barely above a whisper. "Can you help me?" Michael blinked, taken aback. He had always been known for his kindness, especially to children. But this was different. There was an urgency in the boy's eyes, something he couldn't quite place. "Hey, kid," Michael replied, trying to mask his concern with a reassuring tone. "What's the matter? You need help with something?" The boy's small hands trembled slightly as he reached out to Michael. "Please, I need you to help my dad. He's not who he says he is." The words hit Michael like a jolt of electricity, and suddenly the room around him seemed to quiet down. The sounds of chatter, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of the kitchen, all of it faded, and all he could hear was the boy's trembling voice. "Dad, he's not my real dad," the boy continued, barely able to keep his voice steady. He's not nice to me." Michael's heart stopped for a beat. His mind raced as he processed the information. The boy was speaking in a way that didn't make sense for someone his age. He was articulating something that was deeply troubling. The next few moments would alter the course of this afternoon in a way Michael could never have anticipated. With a sudden clarity, Michael knew that this was no ordinary interaction. Something was wrong, and the boy, Kevin, needed help. Michael's eyes flicked toward the man sitting across from Kevin, who was now completely absorbed in his phone conversation. Ethan Parker didn't even glance up. Michael's fingers moved toward his phone. "Stay here, kid," Michael whispered. "I'll take care of this." Michael had settled into a familiar rhythm, his mind drifting to a recent meeting with a young rising star in basketball. The meeting had been productive, but Michael's thoughts kept circling back to something else, something personal. His thoughts often wandered when he was alone, and as much as he tried to resist, they always returned to the quiet emptiness he sometimes felt since retirement. The small town was peaceful, maybe too peaceful at times. Michael had never truly gotten used to the slower pace of life after the rush of the NBA. He missed the excitement, the adrenaline of the game, the camaraderie with his teammates, and the endless travel. Yet, now, he found himself in a quiet corner of this diner more often than he cared to admit. There was solace in the mundane. As he waited for his order, Michael absent-mindedly tapped his fingers on the edge of the table. Glancing around the diner, the elderly couple in the corner booth caught his eye. Their hands were clasped together, both nodding along to the conversation, perhaps discussing their grandchildren or reminiscing about the past. The sight made him smile softly. How simple, how sweet. Then, something shifted in the air, almost imperceptible. The door opened with a soft chime, and in walked a familiar face. Michael's heart skipped a beat. It was David Mitchell, a well-dressed man who appeared to be in his early 40s, with sharp features and an air of quiet authority. David was a regular in the diner, known to some as a businessman from the nearby city who often stopped for a coffee before returning to his hectic schedule. Michael had exchanged pleasantries with him a few times, but they had never shared a deeper conversation. It was David's company that often filled the air with tension. The way his posture and eyes seemed to draw attention, a contrast to the relaxed, easygoing energy of the diner. David's face, though, was set in a way Michael had never seen before. His expression was taut, his brow furrowed in frustration, as he hurriedly walked toward a booth at the center of the diner. Sitting across from him was a little boy, perhaps no older than 5 years old. The boy looked out of place in his worn Spider-Man t-shirt, his sneakers scuffed and stained with dirt. His legs dangled from the booth, unable to touch the ground. The child seemed unfazed by the atmosphere, his eyes focused on a piece of toast he was playing with, seemingly lost in his own world. Michael had never seen the boy before, and yet there was something deeply unsettling about the scene. The boy was too young to be in such a setting without some form of guidance. Michael watched as David Mitchell continued to argue on the phone, his words growing louder, sharper. "This is unacceptable," David muttered, slamming a hand against the table, making the silverware rattle. "You will regret this. It's a disaster, and you're to blame." The though directed at whoever was on the other end of the call, carried a palpable anger. David's eyes darted back and forth between his phone and the boy sitting quietly before him. The boy seemed unaffected, but Michael noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his juice. It was a small thing, but it was enough to draw Michael's attention. Without thinking, Michael stood up from his booth. He didn't know why he felt compelled to act, but something in his gut told him that the situation was not as simple as it seemed. He wasn't usually one to intervene, but the vulnerability of the boy, so clearly isolated, bothered him deeply. He walked over to the counter and nodded to the waitress, who gave him a welcoming smile. Michael scanned the room one more time, his eyes settling on David, still heatedly speaking on the phone, oblivious to his surroundings. Michael debated for a moment, but then he turned and walked toward the booth. David's words continued to spill out in sharp bursts. But when Michael reached the table, he noticed that the boy had turned his head, locking eyes with him. The child's eyes were wide, his expression unreadable. Michael crouched down beside the boy, offering a warm smile. "Hey there," he said softly. "How's your day going?" The boy stared for a moment before blinking and offering a slight, hesitant smile in return. "Good," the boy whispered, his voice so quiet it almost got lost in the din of the cafe. Michael looked back at David, who had finally ended his phone call. The businessman looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing as they met Michael's. For a split second, there was a flicker of something: surprise? Embarrassment? Then it was gone, replaced with a neutral mask. David cleared his throat, smoothing his suit. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with a quiet hostility that Michael could feel. Michael stood up slowly, still keeping his eyes on the boy. "I just thought the boy might enjoy some company," Michael said, his voice even. "He seems a little lonely." David's eyes flared for a moment, but he quickly regained control. "He's fine," he said curtly. "We're just having lunch." Michael didn't press the issue further. Instead, he smiled at the boy again. "All right, take care, kiddo," he said, before turning back to his booth. But something in the pit of his stomach wouldn't let him sit down and forget what he had just witnessed. The situation felt wrong. David's anger, the boy's quiet demeanor, the isolation of it all. Michael sat back down, staring into his coffee, feeling an uneasy tension that wouldn't lift. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on here, and he wondered whether he should get involved. Minutes passed, but the unease in Michael's chest only grew. And then, something happened, something that would change everything. The boy suddenly stood up, his little feet barely able to reach the floor as he walked shakily over to Michael's booth. "Sir," the boy asked, his voice small but clear. Michael froze, his heart suddenly pounding. The boy looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes, but there was something in them that sent a chill down Michael's spine. The boy's next words were simple, yet they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "Please help me." David Mitchell's posture was rigid as he sat across from his son, Kevin, his phone pressed to his ear. The lines on his face, usually calm and collected, were etched with frustration, an emotion that had seemed foreign in their previous encounters. The air between them was thick, almost suffocating. Michael had been a spectator to this scene, silently observing for a few minutes now, but something about the tension in the air tugged at his conscience. The boy, Kevin, sat silently across from his father, his small frame barely able to reach the edge of the booth. He swung his legs back and forth, his worn Spider-Man t-shirt wrinkling with each movement. Unlike his father, Kevin wasn't caught up in the stress of a phone call. Instead, he seemed like any other child his age, bored, distracted, maybe even a little lonely. But something about his eyes gave Michael pause. Kevin was fidgeting, yes, but there was an anxiety in his gaze that didn't sit well with him. He wasn't just bored. No, there was something deeper behind those innocent eyes, a fear that Michael had seen before. It was the kind of fear that often lived behind closed doors, the kind of fear that lingered in quiet moments when the adult world fell short of protecting the child within it. Michael's hand hovered over his cup of coffee, his stomach sinking. He had seen that look before. He had felt it in himself, at a time when everything he thought he knew about the world had been upended. He knew what it meant. Before he could stop himself, He stood up and walked over to David's table, his large frame casting a shadow over the booth. David looked up, momentarily surprised, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. Michael recognized the look, one of someone who knew he couldn't get away with ignoring what was happening in front of him. "David." "Hey," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "I couldn't help but notice. Is everything all right?" David's eyes flickered with irritation for a split second, but it was quickly replaced with a practiced coolness. He gave a small, tight smile. "Oh, Michael, it's nothing. Just some business stuff. Nothing to worry about." But Michael wasn't convinced. He glanced down at Kevin, who had barely acknowledged his presence, too absorbed in his nervous fidgeting. "You know," Michael said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I've seen a lot in my time, and I've learned to trust my gut. Your son," he paused, considering the next words carefully. "He doesn't look like he's fine." David's eyes darkened slightly. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around his phone. "Kevin's just being a kid," he muttered, trying to downplay it. But Michael could hear the slight tremor in his voice. Michael wasn't one to back down easily. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "David, I don't mean to intrude, but I've been in situations like this. I know what it looks like when a kid's not okay." "If there's something going on," Michael trailed off, letting his words hang in the air. For a long moment, there was silence. David looked at Michael, his jaw clenched, clearly torn between brushing the situation off or acknowledging the truth. It was a battle Michael had seen many times, especially in the world of sports and media, a battle between pride and honesty. Then, to Michael's surprise, David's facade cracked. He sighed deeply, lowering the phone and placing it on the table. His shoulders slumped as if a weight had been lifted. "You're right," he said, voice soft. "There's more going on than I'd like to admit." The silence in the cafe seemed to grow heavier as David finally spoke the words that had been haunting him. "Kevin's mother, she's been sick for a while now, and it's been affecting both of us, but especially him. I've been so wrapped up in trying to fix everything that I've overlooked what he might be feeling." Kevin's eyes darted up, finally meeting Michael's gaze. His small lips trembled, but he said nothing. His father's words seemed to open something in him, and Michael could see the vulnerability in the boy that had been hidden behind his nervous fidgeting. "I'm sorry," David muttered, his voice breaking. "I've been so focused on trying to handle everything on my own that I forgot about him. I forgot that he needs help too." Michael could feel the weight of David's regret and the burden of years spent trying to keep up appearances. It was a story he knew all too well. Men who tried to fix everything, only to realize that their greatest strength lay in admitting they couldn't do it all alone. Without a word, Michael sat down at the booth beside Kevin. He didn't need to say much sometimes. Silence spoke louder than anything else. He put a hand on Kevin's shoulder and smiled at him. The boy's eyes were wide, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to smile back. Even if just for a second, David watched his son with a mix of emotions. Michael could see that, for the first time in a long time, David was seeing his son not just as a responsibility, but as a person who needed support just as much as he did. The moment was broken by the sound of a phone buzzing on the table. David picked it up. His expression hardened once more as he read the message. His eyes flickered back to Michael, then down to Kevin. For a brief moment, the weight of his decision seemed to hang in the air. "Thanks," David said quietly, his voice hoarse, "for saying something. I think it's time I deal with this. Really deal with it." Michael nodded. "No one's ever alone in this. Remember that." As David stood to leave, he put a hand on Kevin's shoulder. The boy looked up at him, his eyes no longer filled with the same anxiety. They shared a moment of understanding, one that, though small, carried a world of change. Michael stayed behind for a few minutes, sipping his coffee. The cafe had quieted once again, and the sun had started to dip below the horizon. He wasn't sure how much of a difference he had made, but as he left the diner, he felt a rare satisfaction, a sense that sometimes a simple gesture of noticing someone can make all the difference in the world. For both David and Kevin, this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but at least now, they weren't walking it alone.